Hodkinson, and my presentation to you today is about the most grave injustice our society has ever experienced. I'm here because this is a defining moment in my medical career, and indeed my entire life. It's the fight of a generation. But first, let me tell you why I feel qualified to address you. I'm a medical specialist in pathology and graduate of Cambridge University, UK. I've had many leadership roles in medicine, both provincially and nationally, including those as a university teacher, board examiner, and laboratory accreditation inspector. I was previously the president of the Alberta Society of Laboratory Physicians, otherwise known as pathologists, and have been an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the U of A. I have also been active in public health advocacy for many years as honorary chairman of ASH, Action on Smoking and Health. ASH is the leading non-profit organization tackling the predatory marketing practices of big tobacco. I'm not an anti-vaxxer, conspiracy theorist, or great resetter. I've spent my entire career in evidence-based medicine. No one is an expert in all the fields involved here, but what is desperately needed is for the general public to hear common sense from a qualified person, and I'd like to think that's me, so that's why I'm here. I believe the most important duty of anyone involved in public health is to protect the public from health risks that they cannot effectively manage themselves. In my opinion, during the COVID pandemic, there has been a gross intrusion of government into health matters that could have been perfectly well managed by individual adults, as was the case with all recent pandemics. The degree of this government overreach has resulted in the most profound fear and utterly unwarranted loss of personal freedoms ever witnessed in Alberta in its entire history. In essence, public health is the practice of medicine at a societal level, and it should follow standard medical ethics where every act is performed for good reason. That is no different from the obligation of an individual physician to his or her patient. Society is in fact the patient of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. And in medicine, the primary ethic is the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. But that concept appears to have been totally ignored, as the harmful consequences are, by any measure, grotesquely disproportional to any of the purported benefits. The cure is far worse than the disease. The mandated interventions have been supported at the very least, should have been supported at the very least, by a consensus in evidence-based medicine that they would be successful. However, all the measures being currently undertaken, including masks, these things, I'm sure you're familiar with them, social distancing and closures of all kinds, have no consensus for effectiveness in the medical literature. And in fact, the weight of evidence is against these measures. Masks are, you might say, the very face of this issue, very visible evidence of compliance. The various mandates can only be perceived as arbitrary, knee-jerk reactions for politicians to convince the general public that they are doing something. But politics playing medicine is a very dangerous game, and as being played out in this province, shows no signs of abating. Politicians must get their heads around the fact that in 2021, medicine is impotent at controlling the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic in the general population. The genie is out of the bottle. It's everywhere. And we must accept common sense accommodation, as per the Great Barrington Declaration, as the only viable approach. Let me state emphatically again, nothing works to control the spread of this virus. In my opinion, and many more expert than me, the approach to this pandemic in Alberta was wrong-headed from its very inception. As the Great Barrington Declaration eloquently argues, there should have been no change in public policy compared to previous pandemics. life should not have changed one iota, except for enhanced protection of the vulnerable. The Great Barrington Declaration called that approach focused protection, and the only public health intervention that was needed. I firmly support that conclusion. Dr. Bhattacharya, an internationally esteemed epidemiologist from Stanford, has said that lockdowns are, quote, the biggest mistake ever made in public health, close quotes. Trying to protect the working well with very low risk of death by shutting down the economy is obviously ridiculously naive. But let's step back for a moment and consider the actual risk of death from COVID in Alberta for asymptomatic people who feel no different today from yesterday. Using the government's own statistics, for the working well, those under 65, the risk of death over a whole year was 1 in 15,000. I ask you, does that warrant shutting down an economy that's already tanking? Remember that the strength of a public healthcare system is only as good as the strength of the underlying economy to support it. In my view, the fear and hysteria over COVID is being maintained by two principal drivers. The first driver is brutal international silencing of all counter-opinions, whether from politicians, journalists, or physicians. And the second driver is asymptomatic testing, which is not only useless because of countless false positives, but counterproductive because it drives ongoing public hysteria. Public hysteria, in turn, is being used by politicians to double down on mandates known to be ineffective. You know, if one mask isn't working today, we recommend 2 or maybe 10 next week. Who knows? I attribute the ongoing panic over COVID to a litany of failures. First of all, and most importantly, failure of due diligence from the very get-go on the absurd computer modelling by Dr. Neil Ferguson at Imperial College London in the UK. That was the most singular failure, as it became the predicate for similarly exaggerated responses. Failure to inform the public that there was no consensus in the medical literature for any of the draconian restrictions so arbitrarily introduced. Failure to report to the general public the cumulative adverse consequences of the interventions on general health care, dying relatives, funerals, weddings, church services, school closures, graduations, and thousands of small business bankruptcies. On the way here today, I drove past Grace Life Church. The double steel cordon is still around that church. Failure to halt the testing of asymptomatic people. It should stop immediately. It has no purpose. Failure to produce detailed statistical reporting to inform the working well in lay terms about the actual degree of risk from COVID, and that variants, as Dr. Modry indicated, are nothing to fear. Failure to classify deaths appropriately. The vulnerable population, with many comorbidities, who happen to be COVID positive at the time of their death, are being classified as deaths directly due to COVID. That is statistical sleight of hand. Dying with COVID is not the same as dying of COVID. Failure to promote the life-saving potential of vitamin D, which is totally safe, cheap, and has overwhelming evidence of protection from COVID-19. What used to be called the season of coughs and colds is now being recognized as the season of vitamin D deficiency. In a month or so, the sun will come up again, and we will all start making vitamin D in our skin. And guess what? The pandemic will disappear again. And they'll say, "See, we wrestled it to the ground." To which I say, no such thing. It's the classic fallacy trap. Just because B follows A does not mean that A caused B. Wake up! Failure to communicate to the general public the inadequacies of PCR testing. There are no published statistics in Alberta regarding the percentage of false positive results by PCR-based methods. False positives have a huge multiplier effect on contact tracing, resulting many times that number of people being taken out of the workforce too. The internationally renowned epidemiologists who authored the Great Barrington Declaration have stated categorically that contact tracing is both useless and counterproductive. Failure to inform the public that the vaccines are all strictly experimental, lacking the customary 2 to 4 years adverse event trials, and therefore, in my view, by any definition, unsafe. That is a failure, a spectacular failure, of the second important medical ethic, that of informed consent. There was no need for a rushed vaccine given the scale of risk, and in my opinion, its use is profoundly reckless. Indeed, there are concerns about its safety now for women under 50 and pregnant women already surfacing, which proves the point in spades. The vaccine situation has the potential, of course, of getting infinitely worse if so-called vaccine passports come to play. Yes, they'll say, you can refuse the vaccine if you want, if you think it's unsafe, but you know what? You won't be allowed to travel. How outrageous! And finally, a failure to balance loss of freedoms against the scale of threat. The art of government is in large part about balance. In my opinion, with COVID-19, the Alberta government got the balance badly wrong. It prioritized the containment of COVID over all else. The government's entire focus has been on one virus, ignoring all other measures of health and well-being. Furthermore, the profound loss of personal freedom resulting from the various mandates are an unforgivable assault on the very essence of our humanity and totally unwarranted given the scale of threat. This is not Ebola. This is not SARS. In fact, Sweden and Florida clearly demonstrate that draconian actions have little impact on the final toll from COVID. However, even to debate these questions is now stigmatized by government, the media, and professional colleges as irresponsible and to be resolutely suppressed. The entire population has been intimidated into compliance with the threat of outrageous fines and actual jail for disobedience. The government's encouragement of citizens to snitch on each other is utterly reprehensible. So in summary, these numerous failures of the government of Alberta in the COVID pandemic have directly caused the most monstrous loss of freedoms, unwarranted fear, and horrendous personal consequences ever recorded in our province, and all without any justifiable cause. It must end now, and never be allowed to happen again. The general public must never again have their rights so trampled on, while we are perfectly capable of managing this type of problem ourselves, independent of any government intervention, as we have done so effectively in years gone by. So I repeat for effect, nothing works to stop the spread of this virus through society, nothing could work, nothing did work, and nothing will work. This virus must just be allowed to run its course. Government must simply accommodate to medicine's impotence and allow the public to use its abundant common sense. Open up, Alberta. Thank you for your attention.